The term dorsal is equivalent to which other directional term? Superior, posterior, inferior, or anterior? Posterior. How are the eyes positioned relative to the nose? Lateral, deep, medial, or proximal? Lateral. How is the chin positioned relative to the nose? Superior, inferior, anterior, or medial? Inferior. How is the forehead positioned relative to the nose? Inferior, lateral, posterior, or superior? Superior. How are the lips positioned relative to the teeth? Lateral, superior, posterior, or anterior? Anterior. How is the tip of the nose positioned relative to the bridge of the nose? Posterior, inferior, medial, or anterior? Anterior. How are the eyebrows positioned relative to the eyes? Inferior, medial, posterior, or superior? Superior. How are the cheeks positioned relative to the nose? Deep, lateral, anterior, or medial? Lateral. How is the mouth positioned relative to the chin? Lateral, superior, inferior, or posterior? Superior. How are the ears positioned relative to the eyes? Lateral, deep, anterior, or medial? Lateral. How is the frontal lobe positioned relative to the occipital lobe? Medial, anterior, superficial, or posterior? Anterior. How is the cerebrum positioned relative to the cerebellum? Posterior, anterior, superior, or inferior? Superior. How is the brainstem positioned relative to the cerebellum? Lateral, superior, anterior, or posterior? Anterior. How is the temporal lobe positioned relative to the frontal lobe? Medial, posterior, superficial, or lateral? Lateral. How is the parietal lobe positioned relative to the frontal lobe? Posterior, superficial, inferior, or anterior? Posterior. How is the skull positioned relative to the brain? Medial, inferior, superficial, or deep? Superficial. How is the tongue positioned relative to the palate? Superior, inferior, anterior, or posterior? Inferior. How is the pharynx positioned relative to the oral cavity? Inferior, posterior, lateral, or anterior? Posterior. How is the larynx positioned relative to the esophagus? Posterior, superior, anterior, or inferior? Anterior. How is the esophagus positioned relative to the trachea? Posterior, medial, anterior, or inferior? Posterior. On which aspect of the neck is the Adam's apple located? Anterior, posterior, inferior, or lateral? Anterior. On which aspect of the neck is the cervical spine located? Medial, anterior, posterior, or lateral? Posterior. How is the external jugular vein positioned relative to the sternocleidomastoid muscle? Deep, posterior, superficial, or medial? Superficial. How is the common carotid artery positioned relative to the sternocleidomastoid muscle? Deep, inferior, lateral, or superficial? Deep. How is the chin positioned relative to the hyoid bone? Inferior, superior, posterior, or anterior? Superior. How is the hyoid bone positioned relative to the thyroid cartilage? Superior, anterior, inferior, or posterior? Superior. How is the thyroid gland positioned relative to the thyroid cartilage? Lateral, inferior, superior, or medial? Inferior. How is the bridge of the nose positioned relative to the eye? Lateral, superior, medial, or posterior? Medial. The tear duct is on the what side of the eye? Inferior, medial, superior, or lateral? Medial. On which aspect of the head are the temples located? Posterior, anterior, medial, or lateral? Lateral. The back of the head is the what region? Frontal, occipital, cervical, or parietal? Occipital. The pinna is the what part of the ear? Internal, middle, external, or medial? External. How is the tympanic membrane positioned relative to the pinna? Superior, superficial, posterior, or deep? Deep. How is the cochlea positioned relative to the tympanic membrane? Inferior, anterior, medial, or lateral? Medial. How is the hard palate positioned relative to the soft palate? Lateral, anterior, posterior, or superior? Anterior. How are the fingers positioned relative to the wrist? Distal, proximal, medial, or deep? Distal. How is the hand positioned relative to the wrist? Proximal, superior, distal, or posterior? Distal. How is the trachea positioned relative to the esophagus? Anterior, inferior, posterior, or lateral? Anterior. How is the elbow positioned relative to the wrist? Superficial, distal, proximal, or lateral? Proximal. How is the ankle positioned relative to the foot? Anterior, proximal, superior, or distal? Proximal. How is the elbow positioned relative to the shoulder? Medial, distal, proximal, or anterior? Distal. How is the forearm positioned relative to the arm? Medial, distal, proximal, or anterior? Distal. On which aspect of the hand is the palm located? Inferior, posterior, anterior, or medial? Anterior. On which aspect of the hand are the knuckles located? Medial, posterior, anterior, or superior? Posterior. On which aspect of the arm is the biceps muscle located? Anterior, posterior, superior, or medial? Anterior. On which aspect of the arm is the triceps muscle located? Medial, superficial, posterior, or anterior? Posterior. The olecranon is on the what side of the arm? Anterior, posterior, lateral, or superior? Posterior. How is the shoulder positioned relative to the wrist? Posterior, proximal, distal, or medial? Proximal. How is the hand positioned relative to the elbow? Proximal, posterior, superior, or distal? Distal. How is the forearm positioned relative to the wrist? Medial, distal, anterior, or proximal? Proximal. How is the arm positioned relative to the shoulder? Deep, distal, medial, or proximal? Distal. How are the toes positioned relative to the ankle? Distal, anterior, medial, or proximal? Distal. How is the ankle positioned relative to the toes? Lateral, distal, posterior, or proximal? Proximal. How is the wrist positioned relative to the elbow? Anterior, proximal, medial, or distal? Distal. How is the knee positioned relative to the ankle? Proximal, lateral, distal, or anterior? Proximal. How is the knee positioned relative to the hip? Medial, anterior, proximal, or distal? Distal. How is the hip positioned relative to the knee? Distal, posterior, lateral, or proximal? Proximal. How is the leg positioned relative to the thigh? Distal, proximal, anterior, or superior? Distal. On which aspect of the leg is the patella located? Lateral, posterior, medial, or anterior? Anterior. How is the patella positioned relative to the femur? Posterior, medial, superior, or anterior? Anterior. On which aspect of the thigh are the hamstrings located? Anterior, posterior, superior, or medial? Posterior. The sole of the foot is on which aspect? Dorsal, medial, plantar, or superior? Plantar. The back of the knee is the what region? Popliteal, femoral, crural, or patellar? Popliteal. On which aspect of the leg is the shin located? Superficial, anterior, posterior, or medial? Anterior. On which aspect of the leg is the calf muscle located? Superficial, anterior, posterior, or medial? Posterior. What is the position of the little toe relative to the other digits? proximal, lateral, distal, or medial. Lateral. On which aspect of the foot is the heel located? Superior, lateral, anterior, or posterior? Posterior. What is the term for the top of the foot? Inferior, plantar, medial, or dorsal? Dorsal. How is the hip positioned relative to the foot? Proximal, superior, distal, or posterior? Proximal. How is the femur positioned relative to the tibia? Distal, posterior, inferior, or proximal? Proximal. How is the fibula positioned relative to the tibia? Anterior, lateral, posterior, or medial? Lateral. On which aspect of the thigh are the quadriceps muscles located? Posterior, medial, inferior, or anterior? Anterior. The arch of the foot is on which aspect? Posterior, anterior, superior, or inferior? Inferior. How is the groin or inguinal region positioned relative to the thigh? Distal, posterior, lateral, or proximal? Proximal. How is the heel positioned relative to the toes? Lateral, posterior, anterior, or superior? Posterior. How is the sternum positioned relative to the heart? Posterior, anterior, lateral, or medial? Anterior. How are the lungs positioned relative to the heart? Medial, lateral, anterior, or posterior? Lateral. How is the heart positioned relative to the lungs? Medial, lateral, superficial, or anterior? Medial. How is the skin positioned relative to the muscles? Lateral, superficial, deep, or medial? Superficial. How are the ribs positioned relative to the lungs? Inferior, superficial, deep, or medial? Superficial. How is the diaphragm positioned relative to the lungs? Superior, inferior, posterior, or anterior? Inferior. How is the spine positioned relative to the stomach? Inferior, posterior, lateral, or anterior? Posterior. How is the scapula positioned relative to the spine? Medial, inferior, lateral, or superior? Lateral. How is the heart positioned relative to the sternum? Anterior, posterior, inferior, or lateral? Posterior. How is the liver positioned relative to the diaphragm? Superior, posterior, inferior, or anterior? Inferior. How is the stomach positioned relative to the spleen? Posterior, lateral, inferior, or medial? Medial. How are the kidneys positioned relative to the intestines? Anterior, lateral, posterior, or inferior? Posterior. How is the urinary bladder positioned relative to the pubic bone? Inferior, anterior, posterior, or superior? Posterior. How is the small intestine positioned relative to the large intestine? Distal, posterior, lateral, or proximal? Proximal. How is the abdominal aorta positioned relative to the inferior vena cava? Posterior, right, left, or anterior? Left. How is the pancreas positioned relative to the stomach? Superior, posterior, anterior, or lateral? Posterior. How is the trachea positioned relative to the esophagus and the thorax? Posterior, anterior, lateral, or superficial? Anterior. The spleen is located in which upper quadrant of the abdomen? Lower, right, left, or superior? Left. The liver is primarily located in which upper quadrant of the abdomen? Lower, left, right, or inferior? Right. How is the thoracic cavity positioned relative to the abdominopelvic cavity? Superior, inferior, medial, or posterior? Superior. How is the vertebral artery positioned relative to the medulla oblongata? Posterior, anterior, medial, or lateral? Anterior. What anatomical term is used to describe the region away from the trunk? Distal, contralateral, medial, or posterior? Distal. Which term refers to a plane that divides the body into front and back sections? Inferior, transverse, coronal, or sagittal? Coronal.